Veronica Agard is a poet, writer, community educator, and connector at the intersections of Black identity, wellness, representation, and culture. She experiments with creative healing modalities and puts theories learned into practice. She curated the Who Heals the Healer series and the conference by the same name, and facilitates the Ancestors in Training educational project. Her initiatives are housed in her freelance platform, Vera Icon LLC. Described as living in the future, Veronica is guided by the past and carries out her dreams in the present. Welcome to the podcast, Veronica.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always funny when I hear my bio back because I've written it in pieces. And then
Yeah.
I'm always just like, oh, yeah, I do a lot.
I know, totally. For listeners who are joining us today, we just went through your much longer bio and it is super impressive. This is the truncated version.
Yeah.
So, will you share with us your pronouns and where you're joining us from and anything else you'd like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Veronica Agard. I am also known as Ifa Shadun Sanmi in my tradition, which is Ifa. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling from the land that raised me, which is Ramapo Lenape territory. I live on the side that got drawn up as New York State. I say it like that because the Lenape territory and borders, what are borders? I was born on Lenape land outside of Fort Dix, New Jersey, Army, kiddo. My ancestors called a lot of places home, and the ones that I know are Guyana, St. Kitts, and Barbados on my father's side, with a splash of Portugal because, colonization.
Yeah,
And
right.
which is a whole other rabbit hole conversation around identity, and I'll save that for later. And
Mm-hmm.
then my mother's people called Alabama home, Muskogee Creek
Mm-hmm.
peoples, and enslaved Africans. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm really grateful to the stewards of the lands that I just named, but specifically the Ramapo folks, who are still doing a lot of work. If you take nothing from this conversation, Indigenous folks are still here. Don't put them in the past tense.
That's right. Yeah.
The Indigenous folks that are the stewards of what we now call New York City and the New York City surrounding area are very much doing a lot of work. Don't situate Indigenous people in the past. Not situating Indigenous people in the past and actively learning what's happening on the land that you're a guest on is a part of what I think should be the floor of a land
Yeah.
acknowledgement. That's
Yeah.
not just when we speak, but when our everyday experience, what we support, what we don't support, narratives that we push forward, narratives that we challenge, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for modeling that. Yeah. So, what is the story that led you to do the work you do as a poet, a writer, and this beautiful word that you just told me how to pronounce? How do you pronounce it?
Aberisha.
Aberisha, and community educator and connector. What is the story? And then also, what is an aberisha? I would love to know.
Um, the story is I'm recording this in the house that raised me, which means that as we're shuffling things of like my adult life versus my younger life, I've realized that I've always been a writer. Like I always
Mm,
kept a journal.
totally.
Even did little like what we would now call like manifestation things of like
Yes.
uh sixth grade me was very much invested in joining marching band. Like
Oh
so
my gosh.
I had a little checklist of like
Oh,
I will join marching band, I will do this, like I will do that.
I love
And
it.
it was funny because younger me then went back and checked it off if I did. So I feel like to say when people are like, wow, like Veronica, you do all these things. I'm like, apparently I've always been like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've always been like this. It's just that
Oh.
or the drama in me like now comes out in poetry. But as my
Mm.
mother will tell you, I've always been dramatic. I've always had a touch of the dramatics, whether I was in theater or just, what was it? I was a music and arts kid, so writing,
Mm-hmm.
thespians, even in marching band, I was a drummer.
Nice.
Um, what was it? Which was in the tradition of Southern Black marching band. So like it was the whole thing. We had to
Mm.
dance the whole entire time.
Wow.
What else?
So
Um,
cool.
always what we there's a meme somewhere where it's like, tell me you're a witch without telling me you're a witch, if you
Yeah.
used to go outside and bring things inside and mix it up. And I was like, oh no. so, so like my mom one day was
Oh,
like, do you remember when you would just sit there and like mix stuff up in the kitchen? I'm like, yeah, the kids would call that kitchen witching now. Like, so there's certain things, I'm just like, oh wow, like I've always been
right.
like this.
Right.
I've always been, um, what was it? My teachers used to say things like, oh, she's been here before, she's an old
Mm-hmm.
soul. Like, there's certain things that younger me, like, as whimsical and silly as I am, like,
Mm-hmm.
that is also true, but I've also been very much, like, concerned about the ways of the world, or had a perspective that was a couple of steps ahead of my peers, which at the
Mm-hmm.
time made me, younger me, feel weird. But
Right.
now, older me, looking back in the inner child work, I'd just be like, nah, sis, you were just a little bit ahead. It's okay.
Totally.
Like, it's going
Totally.
to make a lot more sense when you get older and you
Mm-hmm.
find certain things. So I'm recording this in my grandmother's room and you can't see it, but there is a poster of an orisha. Orishas are the personifications of the forces of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they include like 400 plus like different forces, but a
Wow.
lot of the popular ones are Oshun, Shango, Yamaya, Oya, or
Mm-hmm.
she's also known as Yansa. And I didn't know this at the time, but when I lived here as a child, my grandmother always lived across the hall. She still does. And one of her coworkers went to Brazil, which is funnier because I've gone twice within a year because I love it there. But and it's related in a moment. But essentially, her coworker said that she described her to some of the priests and things that she encountered there, and they said, "Oh, she sounds like a Yansa or a
Mm.
Oya."
Mm.
Oya is um, she rides into battle ahead of Shango. That's one of her husbands. Emphasis on one of. She is super fierce warrior, mother of nine, the marketplace. Very much speaks her mind, like rides
Mm-hmm.
the wind. She's known as like the harbinger of change. Like we're recording this in Scorpio season, so there's very much like death
Yeah.
and rebirth and those kind of cycles.
Yeah.
Or like having strength, um, or I don't want to say resilient, because
Mm-hmm.
especially with the way that that has been used against Black women specifically, but that's the only one I have right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so her coworker described her to the folks, and they said, "Oh, she reminds us of this." Turned out that I didn't know that these the things that the coworker brought back, gifts to Yansa that have her image. I didn't know that this was in the room across the hall from me until I want to say maybe a couple of years ago. I'm
Oh
33,
wow.
so I only found that out maybe at 31, and I was like,
Yeah.
in the house the whole time. And my Catholic grandmothers. Well, both of my grandmothers were Catholic, but
Uh-huh.
one of them has passed. But I was like, this is in my grandmother's room the whole time. This is across the hall, bro. What? So fast forward,
Wow.
it's 2016. I, as a survivor, find that in order for me to reconnect to my body, you have to trick me. So, like, younger me would do ballet. You already
Yeah.
heard I did marching band. I very
Mm-hmm.
much can do mind body things. Give me something to do.
Right.
Um, if you play a certain song that we did in marching band, I might remember the routine, right? Because
Right.
it
Yeah.
forced me to go inside of my body and get out of my mind.
Yeah.
A practice that helped me get out of my mind in 2016 was capoeira, which
Mm,
is the
yes.
Afro Brazilian martial art that has a deep relationship with Candomblé, deep relationship with the Colombos and the histories of um, the ways in which enslaved Africans resisted down there. And a friend of mine was teaching capoeira at the time. And the long story short ish is that one of my guardian orishas is Oya,
Hmm.
right? Who was apparently across the hall from me the whole time. The other one is Shango, which is very much the ideas that we have the masculinity around fertility and dancing and the life of the party kind of energy. He's very much business and strategy,
Hmm.
battle hardened, but also can be soft. Like he's thunder and lightning, but also has a special relationship with the rain, right? And
Mm.
rainwater. And there's a beautiful story of like how he became an Orisha that I'm podcast for another time, but
Okay. Yeah.
he was and is the guardian Orisha of my former capoeira group.
Oh,
And I
wow.
didn't know that until the capoeira master at the time, who is initiated in Candomblé, was talking to me about it. And I was just like, oh, so we've been singing to like, oh, so, and I started to thread some of the things together. The storyteller in me was like, oh, okay, I can put this here and draw this here and sew this thread of like,
Right.
oh, I this resonates with me. Why does this resonate? Right? Or like,
Yeah.
why do I feel in home in a practice that isn't necessarily mine or indigenous to where my ancestors came from, but
Hmm.
as my capoeira master, who is former capoeira master, who is from Bahia, from Salvador specifically, which, if you know anything about Brazil, that is one of the highest concentrations of Black folks outside of the continent of Africa.
Mm.
He said to me that because I am a daughter of the Black diaspora, I have just as much as, if not more, of a claim to ancestral Black traditions just because of when my
Totally.
ancestors survived. So
Hmm.
all of that swirled around to encourage me to get a reading,
Hmm.
and to encourage me to find my now godfather in my tradition, who also plays capoeira and is also
Oh.
um, descended from Guyanese folks. And I was like, oh yeah, yeah, like ancestors allowed. Like, yep. Mm-hmm. Oh, and you're a Sagittarius too. Yep.
Oh.
Like
Yeah.
we gonna get along just fine.
Right.
So I completed a rites of passage that now allows me to say that I am an Aberisha, which just means that I'm a baby in the tradition. It's a beautiful
Mm.
word, but that's all that
Okay.
means. Um,
Nice. I love that. I love that.
that's all that means. I felt that it was important to explain the how of how we got there, especially for folks that watch the YouTube video. You'll see that I have some of my elekes on, which are um, some of my ties to some of the energies that are either guiding me, or depending on what we're talking about, or depending on the day of the week, I'll wear different ones. So right now I'm wearing the one for my ancestors, or Egungun, with Yemaya and Oshun.
Mm.
Just given the topic, and we're talking about fertility and
Yeah.
birthing, I was like, you know what, let me put the water on.
Yeah.
I also am a very like Shango and Oya have a very fiery connotation, so I'm kind of fiery. So
Hmm.
I need water sometimes. So
Right.
I
Yes.
brought the water out, just as a reminder to be to keep the fire, but also like to be, to be a little sweet and to embrace the lover girl in me, which we'll talk about later.
Oh, I love that. Wow, what a beautiful story. I can just see so much like imagery so clearly of all this. Yeah, even just talking about how you got to where you are and doing the work you do, you are such a storyteller. You can tell. Yeah. Amazing. So I loved reading that you, with every opportunity, you name the power of storytelling and being believed in. That like gave me goosebumps when I read that. Will you say more about that? And I just agree with that so much.
Yeah, so especially as a survivor, as some things, when I was a child, there's so much power in even in those moments that are horrible, right? Of being
Mhm.
believed in, right? Off rip, no questions asked, right? Not everybody can say that,
Yeah.
um, which is why it's not that moment only, but just saying that to say that some of my work, since, or at least what I'm known for in this present moment, which started in 2012, really. And I'm saying that like that I was like, yeah, that was a couple of years ago. Like,
I
no,
know.
fam, that was 12 years ago. Because what is
I
time?
know.
Um, because the
Uh,
COVID years, I'm like, it's still the summer 2019 was not that, and it was
I
anyway.
know. I know.
Um, the the work that I did in undergrad, I went to City College of New York, which is in Harlem. It's in our public school system out there. It's north of Columbia. Um, there's it's not a shade to Columbia, but just we're the public school version of Columbia. We were once known as Harlem University, right?
Cool.
It's very important to me to go to a school that reflected the diversity that I had in my high school.
Mhm.
My high school was like 60 something percent black, and of that, it
Mm.
was majority Caribbean. So I was like,
Mhm.
okay, yeah, I gotta go to the city. I can't stay up here in suburbia
Right.
land. I was like, nah.
Yeah. Right,
So
right.
respectfully, no.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm not trying to yuck anybody's yum, but young me was like, nope, go down to the
Right.
city.
Nice.
Um, so storytelling and being believed in and supporting the work of survivors really came to a head at City College because I was a part of a group called the Sister Circle Collective, which did exactly what it sounds like. We circled and we really took some of the teachings from the course that one half of Brujas of Brooklyn on social media, Dr. Griselda Rodriguez Salomon, instilled in us. And we really were just kind of like, all right, like we want this to live outside of the classroom. We are radicalized enough at the time anyway, because we were very young, um, to know that that conversation shouldn't just live inside the classroom, because not only was that class always on a wait list, like we were privileged enough to be able to go to school. So we
Mm.
had a sense to be like, all right, well, what if we just, and I don't say just to diminish, but I mean that to say, what if we circle? What if we hold space? What if we make sacred containers? Right?
Mm.
Which
Mhm.
at the time for our age group, it's not that there weren't other people doing it, but there weren't as many folks doing it in our age bracket at the time of like
Yeah.
21, 22, or like somewhere around there.
Mhm.
Um, so we did a lot of work around, getting a gender resource center or advocating for one on the campus, really because there was such a need. There were a lot of people who needed to be believed in
Mhm.
or better resourced and better serviced, and they weren't getting the services that they needed. And then we got politicized right around the time. And I say that to say that there's different flashpoints for a lot of folks. There's
Mhm.
different. So what I started to say was it's similar to the flashpoint of 2020 when George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were killed. We
Mhm.
had our own moment like that here in New York City when Eric Garner was killed.
Mhm.
And a lot of us were organizing and doing work on our campuses and then sowing seeds to say, oh, but wait, like we're organizing and we're rallying, and it's not to dismiss um, the loss of life, but it's to say, but if that's happening to men, it can't only be happening to men. It has to be happening
Mhm.
to the full spectrum of gender and identity and the
Mhm.
intersection within Blackness. So
Right.
we were able to organize a contingent and like famously linked up with um, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw,
Oh,
and
wow.
that was like the moment when, say, her name became a thing, right? So we
Wow.
were in this space of in betweenness of like, okay, this is important work. We know that this is important work. People are telling us how important it is for them to be heard.
Right.
And then some of our counterparts in like different movement spaces were like, oh, they just sit around and light candles and talk shit. Like that's all they do. We're just kind of looking around like, huh, what? But then you want us to, organize, and you want us to do all the, the invisible labor that
Mm-hmm.
makes you an organizer. So what are you really organizing?
Mm-hmm.
So
Right. Right. Yeah. Totally.
it's very much like, what are you even organizing? But anyway, I say all that to say that work has since ended. It ended in 2017, but I'm saying that here in 2023, about to go into 2024, where um so grateful to live in a time where Healing Justice Lineages, the book, is out, because it affirms a feeling that we had back then of like, no, this is important work. This is necessary
Mm-hmm.
work. We just
Yeah.
didn't know where we were on that timeline yet.
Right.
Now looking back, we're like, oh, we were, it's not that we were ahead of the game, but we were definitely in a lane
Yeah.
that, you know, hadn't necessarily taken off yet, or other folks were doing it, but we didn't know and we weren't in community, right? So I say that to
Mm-hmm.
say it's not like we were the only ones and Veronica's out here talking about that they were the only ones doing that work. No, 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 that's not what I said.
Right.
But
Right.
sometimes healing work and organizing work, you can feel isolated. You can feel, even in
Mm-hmm.
a city like New York, you can feel
Yeah.
isolated because, sometimes it gets a little clicky, and like,
Yeah.
who knows who, and like, who has these
Totally.
resources and who's connected to this person, as opposed to the type of connector that I aspire to be and hope that I am, where I say, okay, word, you want me to do this? Actually, I'm not a good fit for that, but I know who is.
Mm-hmm.
Here's this person's information. Tell them I sent you. Or,
Right.
like developing ecosystems of folks that it's like, okay, I know an herbalist, I know a doula. My friends, when they are expecting, my first question is, what kind of doula do you want?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because I
Yeah.
try not to assume anything about how they feel about it. I'm like,
Uh-huh.
what kind of doula do you want? Do you want a doula to help you bring the kiddo earthside, or do you
Mm-hmm.
want a different kind of doula?
Right.
And just listening from that perspective. But definitely, I'm a big connector in that regard. I'm like,
Yeah.
whenever I do have a kid, I'm gonna go through the Rolodex and be like, so hello, hi, like
Yeah.
it's time. Um, but that's the kind
Totally.
of, the kind of connector that I aspire to be.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that comes from some of the work that we did back then, some of the relationships that I still have, like some of um the work behind the scenes, like before, um not before, back when Instagram was just a photo app.
Yeah. Remember that?
So it's just like, what? I'm like, yeah. So when y'all hear this and you're like, Instagram was just a photo app, I'm like, yeah, we used to take highly saturated photos of like whatever we were eating, and
Right.
like, airplane window seats and whatever.
Yes.
Like that was the vibe, okay? now,
Totally.
now it's a
Totally.
whole other thing, a
Yeah.
whole other
Yeah.
a whole other way of being community with each other.
Mhm. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. Um, so a lot of the work you do is around connecting with our ancestors. This is how I found you a long time ago. I've been following your work for a while, and I started doing some ancestor work and came across you on Instagram, and I just everything you posted was so powerful and spoke so deeply to me, and I learned so much. And so I really want to talk about that today. So, and especially in the context of creating the next generation, and kind of where we, and especially as queer folks, especially as bi PGM, where we find ourselves in that relationship, as you've described it as a bridge, between like the ancestors and our descendants. So maybe let's start at the beginning of like, why is it important to create relationships with our ancestors? And the two questions that always come up to me around this is, what if we don't know our ancestors? And what if we're queer and we don't know if our ancestors would support our queerness? Yeah, anything to say around those questions?
Yeah, thank you so much for that affirmation. Speaking of Instagram, right? I feel like the good news is that, one, that I made the Instagram when I did, but two, that has grown in a lot of ways, and it's wild and whimsical because it's practically doubled in the sense of size on Instagram.
I bet.
Only because I changed the aesthetic of what I posted. That's
Oh,
literally
interesting.
the only thing. I'm self guided and taught around like designs and graphics and website. Anything that you see on the Ancestors in Training page, unless I tag somebody and say they did it, it was
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
It,
Nice.
it was
It's
me spending
beautiful.
thank you. It was me
Yeah.
hanging out in Canva for a very long time.
Nice. I love
Canva
it.
and Squarespace, like that's been
Yeah.
going back to a little bit to talking about the work that I did in undergrad. That's always been my role, like
Mm,
the media person, the archivist, the okay, do we
right.
have a photographer? Okay, no, I'm gonna take the photo, right? Like that's always
Right.
kind of been my jam, so it comes
Mhm.
out in my projects.
Nice.
Um, we got here because the forces beyond our control, but we really got here because my paternal grandmother, my namesake grandmother, Helen Veronica Agard, she passed away in 2012, top of 2012. And she had onset Alzheimer's and dementia. And folks that have been subscribed, tuned in to my work for a little bit, y'all already know this story. But um, when she passed, there were a lot of questions that I, at 21, had of her
Mm.
regarding our lineage, regarding where we came from, but I couldn't ask her because I
Right.
didn't
Right.
know which version of her I was going to get.
Yeah.
She always remembered me, to her credit. She always remembered me, but
Mhm.
sometimes she would make me like older than I was.
Mhm. Right.
Um, but she always remembered me.
Yeah.
And then a bunch of things fell out the family closet, as they tend to do when
Yeah.
somebody passes away. And I realized
Mhm.
that I had a lot more family on that side than I had been raised to believe. And there was
Oh,
a
wow.
whole bunch of intergenerational trauma and things that predate me. And again,
Yeah.
it's not to say anything about that other than that, especially because folks were doing the best that they could with the resources that they had, especially we're talking about still underneath the British Empire, Caribbean folks, and what resources they did or did not have in like the
Mhm.
30s and 40s,
Right.
um, and even earlier than that. So that is when I started to get into or think about or wonder about spirituality.
Mm. Mhm.
And it matched with this inkling that I already had as being the family archivist, right?
Mm.
Or the fake family genealogist, right? I've had an
Right.
ancestry.com, and this is not a sponsored post, but I have had an ancestry.com account since before they did the DNA,
Oh,
right? Like just
wow.
to
Yeah.
use the family tree function.
Oh,
I've
interesting.
been that person. So
Right.
then
Oh, that's cool.
in my journey to figuring out like, okay, well, what works, what doesn't, a
Mhm.
lot of it, and I wish that this was talked about more, a lot of spirituality is like trying different things and trying and seeing like, okay, does this resonate, does this not, and like
Right.
having that kind of discernment to be like, oh, like I don't feel like how I'm supposed to feel, or like
Mhm.
even with getting readings from certain folks, like not every reader is a match for you,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And that's okay. That doesn't mean
Yeah.
that they're not gifted at what they do. It just might not work.
Totally.
So very much
Yeah.
like the and Sister Circle collective timelines definitely helped with that cultivation.
Mhm.
Um, and then the writer in me at that time was trying to figure out how I wanted just me, Veronica, how
Mhm.
I wanted to show up and how I wanted to facilitate, not just Veronica, who's a part of Sister Circle, but me.
Right.
Um, and then around that time, started to gain a couple more ancestors. Really, like at that point, I had done the DNA test, and it was very much like, okay, but what about, you know, the chance that, how can I say this? Especially being descended from the United States South, there is a
Mhm.
big mythology out there around having Native American lineage. Um, and doing the DNA test and being like, I don't want to call my ancestors a liar because it might have been easier for them to claim the indigeneity over acknowledging how that whiteness got in there.
Sure.
Right. So, like, some of these things came up, and I was like, all right, this is coming up for me. So I know
Mhm.
that this is going to come up for other folks. Doesn't matter what their racial background is. Right.
Right, right.
Um, so that's a part of how we got here, started circulating. We're almost at a year. What is it? We're almost 7 years to the day, December 1st. I want to say it was December 1st. Yeah, December 1st, 2017.
Oh, wow.
It's technically 6 calendar years, but it'll be 7 cycles of us doing this work. My friend and collaborator Shire Share had a conference called the Diaspora Radicalex.
Mhm.
And they trusted me enough to be like, hey, I want to try out this thing. I'm going to call it Ancestors in Training. And they were like, yeah, sure, come. You only have
Oh,
30
nice.
minutes though. And I was like, 30 minutes. So like that was the
Oh,
first
wow.
workshop I ever did around
Nice.
that topic.
Yeah.
And thank God it was recorded, because then sometimes people are like, well, how come? I was like, nah, bro, I have the receipts. Bro is gender neutral for me. So
Yes, yes, totally.
but it's like, nah, I've got my receipts,
Right,
like, and every now and again I have to bring the receipts out, because as the Instagram community grows, and I don't assume that folks have been following me for a while, I'm like, in case y'all just stumbled in here, welcome. We've been
right,
talking about this for a while.
right.
But
Yeah,
trying to think. And then, speaking of, we've been talking about this for a while, almost every time I circle, but especially when I circle around um intergenerational compassion, that's usually where this question comes up about, um, what if my ancestors wouldn't accept me for who I am,
right.
right? Specifically within the queer community. And I think, and this is my attempt at an answer, this is not always a complete answer. This answer changes slightly every time I answer it. But there were definitely queer ancestors in our lineage, but they just, for a combination of a lot of things, could not be open about it,
Totally.
because there was a lack of safety there.
Yeah.
Two, depending on the tradition, there were a lot of different queer, um, or non-conforming spirits. I'm thinking of,
Yeah.
specifically within my lineage, I'm thinking about Olokun, who is
Mm.
the part of the ocean that we can't see.
Mm.
Not to be
Love
confused
that.
with Yamaya, who's the part that we tend to go, frolic in.
Right.
Olokun can be described either way, or like somewhere in between, lack thereof. That language is changing, I think,
Mhm.
in part to conversations like these.
Yeah.
I also did a talk years ago, curated a panel on queering divinity, which
Mm.
featured folks in the tradition who are queer and were like, okay, so what does this even mean? Like, how can we have this conversation? Because depending on your lineage within, um, the Orisha based practices, or the African traditional or African diasporic traditions,
Right.
some of those spaces are safe and some of
Mhm.
those spaces are not.
Right.
Or some of those spaces you can be brave, some of those spaces you can't be. So,
Yeah.
like, that conversation, which it's still up, and I'll include that as a resource for this talk
Oh, cool.
specifically, um, that came up then around, like, not just wondering about our ancestors accepting us, but like people that we're in spiritual community with. Like, yes, our ancestors, but what about people in real time here on earth that I can
Right.
look at in the face? What do they accept me? Do they not?
Right. Yeah.
And the answer to that is so complex and so situational. But my invitation to folks is to if they don't know, that they become that one, right? So we're thinking about forward and back, right? So we're thinking about doing the work for those that have already passed on, or already ancestors, but as ancestors in training, thinking about those that are
Yeah.
here, or those that are already on their way. So my
Right.
invitation to folks is, if you don't know or you don't have any, then be that one.
Yes, I love that.
And then, especially if you don't know all of your ancestors, this comes up with folks who have complicated family histories or may have been adopted, then to think about it from a perspective of inviting the ancestors that would have had love for you, would have compassion for you, that were honorable, that lived honorable lives when they were still here, right? Even if you don't know them, trusting that they know you.
Right.
And that's a big practice of surrender. That's why I say this is a start of an answer, because for folks that want tangible things, I'm like, the most tangible thing I can give you is that talk that we did back in 2018,
Yeah.
kiki kiki key, because that's so deeply personal and deeply intimate.
Yeah.
Within my
Yeah.
circles, I try to, you know, start people on their journey of being an ancestor in training. I don't,
Mm-hmm.
bop people, and dub them or give them this, certificate or whatever. I'm like, nah,
Yeah.
you're already this. You're already okay. If you can
Right.
relate to the fact that our time here is not, you know, long. We want it to be long. We wish long life, prosperity for everybody. But in the scheme of the world, in the
Mm-hmm.
scheme of the world, we're not going to live forever.
Yeah.
So since our time here is finite, like, what are we going to do with our time? And if you can get down with that,
Yeah.
then we can talk about anything else. We can hold space for anything else. And also, a
Totally.
lot of my work is listening. So when I hear that come up, I'm like, okay, I need to hold another container that's for this, right? Or like we just did one around tending to grief and healing because of everything that's happening in the world.
Right.
And being like, yeah, there's a lot of this time of year is sensitive for folks anyway, but it's like
Yeah.
it's a lot, like times 10. Like
Yeah.
how can I show up in
Yeah.
this moment? And I think that that's my when folks think about their role in the revolution, I'm like, that's mine. Like to be the
Mm.
connector or to be the healer archetype and say like, okay, I made this space for you to land, for you to
Mm-hmm.
recharge, go rally forth and go back to whatever you were doing, how you were showing up in the world.
Yes.
But yeah, that's my
I love
my
that.
long-winded answer around, but what about an acceptance from all of my ancestors? My responsibility as the steward of ancestors in training is to, like I said, if not me, then who? I'm like, this person speaks about this more often than I do. This person has this resource of like whatever this is, right?
Right.
So another thing that comes up is like, but what about white folks? I'm like, this ain't about y'all, but it is, because as my godfather says, unless you're an alien, everybody has ancestors because we all have a belly button. So that
Right.
means that like
Yeah.
white folks, y'all have ancestral traditions. It's just that, in the process and the creation of whiteness, you
Mm-hmm.
erased it from each other.
Totally.
You did that to each
Totally.
other first in the closing of the commons, the witch trials, the Inquisition, all of that. Y'all
Right.
did the what happened to the Celts. It's like y'all did
Mm.
that to yourselves and then said, "Oh, we already know how to handle or deal
Right.
with indigenous people everywhere else because y'all already knew what to do." So I'm
Right.
saying that to say that when folks are like, "But what about white people?" and like, "What do you think about them?" and that I'm like, they have ancestors too. They definitely have more work to do though in terms of ancestral healing than I may do as a black person. It may look
Right.
different. It
Right.
may be a lot more complicated. It may not.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It depends.
Yeah.
But I say that to say when folks are like, "Well, who is your work for?" I'm like, it's for everybody technically because again, since we confirmed that aliens are real, unless
Yeah.
unless you're an alien,
Right.
it's for everyone. But just know that it's centering the global majority, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
centering folks who traditionally are not centered.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. That makes sense. I love that. Everyone who has a belly button has an ancestor. Has ancestors. So I would love to talk about kind of what, from your point of view, is our responsibility to shape a better present, a better future, on a fertility journey as folks embark on a fertility journey, as our role as ancestors in training, um, and kind of bringing in our descendants, the next generation of ancestors. I would love to talk about that. our role as that bridge, like what the importance
Yeah.
of that is.
So let me backtrack a bit. And this is gendered, so I'm gonna try and translate the science that's limiting to being more affirming.
Cool.
So anyone who can carry a child, like
Mm-hmm.
we are the parts of us that make us us were in our grandmother in this case. We were, or at least some of the parts of us that would become us in the
Right.
flesh started in one of our grandparents, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I like to think about it from that perspective, especially anytime that my mom is like, yeah, you and your grandmother cut of the same cloth because y'all be like, and like, key, key,
Yes.
key, 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 and like, like we talk pretty fast. But then
Right.
even in the sense of, the process and start to finish of birthing, right? That's such a sacred thing. That's such a tender space.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably why I have a lot of respect for doulas and midwives of all kinds because I'm not a parent, but I'm definitely an auntie to like a couple of kiddos
Yeah.
in community, and I'm just like, that's like what? Like just in the sense of like just the bewilderment that I have at times,
Yeah.
and I think that having that kind of you know that sense and that understanding, which I definitely get it. While there's a lot of folks who are like you, like that are doing that kind of work with birthing folks and fertility and birth work overall, right? Because it makes sense. Like it's not that that's the easiest audience, but it's like birth workers are like, yeah, because we catch the next generation. Absolutely, we are ancestors in training. Got it, right? So I
Mm.
say that to say, I I think that so much of that work is really being in reverence and awe and like supporting folks as they decide to become parents, because another thing that's happening in real time is, and this is something that I say often with ancestors in training in general, it's partially rooted in the indigenous to Turtle Island tradition and medicine of doing the work for the next 7 generations. And
Right.
then I extend that to thinking about not only the ones that are the 7 generations forward, but also thinking about the next three or the
Mm-hmm.
next 2 or 3 because of climate change
Yeah.
and the climate crisis that we're in, right? Not just
Yeah.
change, like it's
Right.
changing, like it's
Yeah.
happening,
Yeah.
right? And the intersection there of climate justice and birthing justice, I'm like, yeah, naturally that makes sense because I'll have conversations with my friends and it's like, okay, so these United States, that ain't the move long term. Like, where we going, right? So, in the key of like expat shenanigans, like where we going, and then
Right.
looking around on the map, like, oh, can't go to this ancestral land because it'll be underwater.
Right.
Oh, we can't go over here because it'll be too hot. Oh, we
Mm-hmm.
can't go over here because of whatever. And that is a conversation that I've been having with myself, and if my parents catch this, this is not a pregnancy announcement, but it's like there's a couple of things I would have to do for that to happen. That hasn't happened. But in a
Right.
world where I'm fortunate enough to have a kid, that is something that I actively think about. I'm like,
Mm.
where are my parents? And then where am I? Okay, I don't know who that partner is yet though. So like just thinking about it from
Right.
that perspective. And I have a whimsical take on it.
Yeah.
But for some folks, it's a deeply um, and everyone's fertility journey is different. Some folks have more challenges. Like I myself am a rainbow baby, which means that my
Mm.
mom had a miscarriage before me.
Right.
And thinking about it from that perspective of like, it's not, um, we're not here by accident.
Yeah.
Like from a literal perspective, from a spiritual perspective, we were prayed for, prayed over.
Mm-hmm.
Um, carried into, and in my tradition, we on the other side chose to be here, chose to come back,
Yeah.
made a contract with creation that said, okay, I'm going to do this work and I'm gonna do whatever it is that I came here to do. And then when we get here to this side, we forget. So
Right.
part of our journey on this side is to remember why we chose to come back. And I
Hmm.
think that that ties into this question because we can, anyone really, but especially folks who are choosing to become parents, can walk with that kind of knowledge of like, okay, like what kind of world am I bringing this person into? What do I want them to know about where they come from? Are there any cycles that I want to start? That's one of my favorite things to talk about because rightfully so,
Yeah.
there's a lot of work to do and cycles to break. But I am
Hmm.
also team, what cycles are you going to start?
Yeah.
Because in general, my
I
general
love that.
philosophy is it's not enough to talk about what we're not going to do,
Yes.
right? Because I also don't like double negatives. So I'm like, can we? I'm like, yes, but also flip side, like yes, and can we talk
Yeah.
about what we're gonna do instead? Yes,
Yeah.
and oh, so going back to a question that we had before, um, my descendants is maybe something that somebody says my descendants will know that like I as a queer person, I as a gender nonconforming person, I as a lived my truth. So that way my descendants who come after me can live their truths, right?
Right.
Like these are some of the things that can go into the facility process or even in prayers or just things that we write down. It could also go into the choices that people make when choosing a doula, when choosing a
Hmm.
midwife,
Yeah.
and making that kind of birthing plan and like trying to find folks who believe in similar things, right? So that way that child comes earthside and is already, already in that container, and it can
Yeah.
be a braver, safer space for them for to as they grow to express themselves in any kind of way.
Totally. Ah, I love, love, love that. Starting the what cycles are we going to start? Yeah. I love that. Excellent. So I see that we only have about a few more minutes. I want to jump to the end of this. I know it goes so fast. I feel
I
like I need to start having like double podcasting, like where we have like two
Yeah, and
episodes per guest.
I talk a lot, so I'm
I love
very
it.
I talk a lot. And what is
I
it?
love it.
Luke, who ran the Bushwick podcast, said this once, and I was like, "Oh, this is the perfect way to describe me." He said that I am whimsical and winding in one moment, and then said I'm super tactical in the next. And I was like, "That is a quote. I am using that for the rest of my life because that is
Yes.
exactly." I'll be like,
Yeah.
and then be like, "And boom, I
And
didn't
then you
forget your
nail it.
question."
Yeah.
Nailed it. So we could definitely do a part two because I know that there were a lot of questions that we didn't
Yeah, no,
necessarily
I would
get
love to
to.
do a part two if you want. Would you like to come back for a part two?
Yeah, we can do
Okay,
a part two for sure. So we don't
cool.
feel like we have to
Yeah, pack it all in. Yeah.
rush or potentially cheapen the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Yay. Perfect. Okay, so I'll jump to the end and then we'll get you back here for a part two. So how can people find you and support you and buy all your things?
Yeah, so the easiest way, if you really like ancestors in training as a concept, as a vibe, as a thing, you can go to ancestorsandtraining.org. You will find all the things, including our shop. We have merch now.
Yes.
I'm not wearing it because I'm a bad promoter, but we have a lot of different things. We've got stuff for kids now, adults. We've got notebooks, right? Because since we invite people to write all the time, I was like, we should make a notebook.
Yeah.
Try to make intentional, but also swaggy things for people to wear. When we have workshops and things, it'll be on the Take Action page of our website. A lot of folks are over on socials at Ancestors in Training on Insta, but we also have a newsletter. And I tend to tell the newsletter things first before I post it on social media. So you might want to get over there. And then if you want to see anything that I myself am doing, poems, lover girl antics, if you will, traveling, all those, all those kind of things. You can find me at Vero's Got the Juice on IG. What else am I supposed to say? Oh, I can say this here. This is a, you heard it here first. Like, so, we are launching a deck.
Mm.
We are launching a deck, but we need help to do
Oh,
so.
nice.
So by the time you hear this, there should be future me should have done what I'm about to say, which is that we're going to have launched a fundraiser slightly to be able to work with the designer and do all the things that way. So
Oh,
when
awesome.
you hear this, consider making a donation to that, so that way, not only one, you can be a part of creating something that you can physically hold, right? Because
Hmm.
I love technology, but I also believe in being able to create things like whether it's the merch or like this deck that people can physically hold
Totally.
and carry with them. And, so
Oh, I
that's
can't
that.
wait. Yay. That's so exciting. Well, thank you so much for coming today and having this conversation. I can't wait to continue talking with you. And
Yeah, because there's a
yeah,
whole section of questions that we have to
I
skip.
know. I know. We'll come back to it. We will.
Yeah, or skipped
Thank you
for
so
now.
much. Yeah, skipped
Thank
for
you.
now. Exactly.
Yeah, no, this was a really wonderful way to start my day, kind of, because I tend to
Yeah.
be an afternoon girl. But yeah.
Nice. Oh, thanks so much.